Louis XIV was known as the most beautiful king in European history. He had a perfect physique and an almost godlike charisma, and he could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without even breaking a sweat. Foreign ambassadors would literally swoon as he passed by. This was a man who spoke 5 languages fluently and could recall the names of 3,000 nobles in his court. But you know what history books usually skip over. The same king who created the most stunning palace ever ended up dying as a 310-pound, decaying, toothless lump of infected flesh. His own courtiers had to wear scented masks just to get close to him. The smell was so unbearable that foreign diplomats actually threw up during royal meetings. I've got these secret medical records that show every gruesome detail of how Europe's golden god ended up as a walking corpse, evidence that French historians have tried to keep hidden for 450 years. If this shocking truth about absolute monarchy is new to you, go ahead and hit that like button to help others find out what really went on behind the palace walls. I'm about to share 3 horrifying medical secrets that will completely change your perspective on European royalty. Just imagine this. On May 6, 1661, at the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV, who was only 23 years old, gracefully descends the marble staircase. He's wearing a ceremonial robe that weighs 33 pounds and is beautifully embroidered with real gold thread. A crowd of 5,000 people holds its breath as this 5.8-foot-tall king, boasting rippling muscles and shiny black hair, walks past Venetian mirrors that reflect his flawlessly sculpted physique. The afternoon sun shines through the crystal-clear windows, bathing everything in a warm, golden light that highlights a monarch who truly represents perfection. His strong, commanding voice carried easily from 150 feet away. When courtiers talked about his striking blue eyes, they likened them to shooting stars that seemed to connect directly with your soul. As he strolled through the halls, his confident stride made the sturdy hardwood floors of Versailles almost shudder beneath him. His natural masculine scent was so captivating that both men and women would genuinely swoon as he walked by. This was a stark contrast to what lay ahead. However, what many people don't understand about the young Sun King is quite different. He was more than just a handsome noble. This was a guy who could speak French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German with ease. By the time he turned 20, he could outfence his Italian instructors, who were known as the finest swordsmen across Europe. Louis XIV would perform ballet for 6 hours straight without any signs of fatigue, and then he'd compose poetry so stunning that it brought tears to the eyes of the famously stoic British ambassador when it was recited at court. Young Louis's physical abilities were truly remarkable, almost like something out of a superhero story. Court records indicate that he ate 4 complete meals along with 3 extra snacks daily, all while keeping a muscular physique. He would spend 8 hours hunting wild boar in the forests surrounding Versailles, and then he'd go out dancing until 3 a.m. He never seemed tired at all. His memory was truly remarkable. He could recall the names and faces of more than 3,000 nobles in his court, along with personal details about their families. Plus, his legendary appetite went well beyond just food. The palace servants quietly noted that he had close relationships with at least 12 different women each month. Foreign diplomats were amazed by what one Venetian ambassador described as Louis XIV's almost supernatural charm. Whenever he walked into a room, conversations would halt, hearts would quicken, and even fierce political opponents were captivated. This was the pinnacle of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV embodied it perfectly. Every morning, more than 100 nobles would actually compete for the privilege of presenting him with his silk shirt during the well-known lever ceremony. They would debate about who got to hold his mirror, who could pour his washing water, and who was deemed worthy enough to tie his shoes. The evening coucher was yet another display of royal grandeur, where adult men would fervently vie for the chance to extinguish his bedside candle. The Palace of Versailles was created to serve as a grand backdrop for this celestial spectacle. Every day, 10,000 courtiers filled the space, with each gesture meticulously planned for the greatest effect. As Louis XIV strolled through the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection appeared to amplify his divine presence endlessly. The marble he stood on was brought in from Italy, costing millions by today's standards, all to ensure that the Sun King's steps would carry the weight of imperial power. Yet, even during these opulent times, there were unsettling signs of what lay ahead. Records from the secret court physician, which weren't decoded until 1987, showed concerning indicators that everyone opted to overlook. By the time he turned 25, Louis XIV needed 2 or 3 enemas every day just to have a bowel movement. His ongoing struggle with constipation was due to his habit of eating 6 to 8 meals a day, which can really only be called compulsive overeating. The warning signs were all around him, if only someone had bothered to pay attention. His breath was so bad that he had to keep eating peppermint candies to cover up the smell. His skin was greasy and marked with acne scars, all covered up with thick layers of white powder and blush. Court documents reveal that he dealt with ongoing digestive problems that needed daily medical care. However, all of this was skillfully concealed from the public eye through complex court procedures meant to disguise any weakness as a kind of divine ceremony. The most important thing to note was that Louis XIV completely refused to take baths. He would only wash his hands and face every morning, and that was all he did. In fact, his whole body was cleaned maybe twice throughout his entire life. While this wasn't uncommon for that time, it stemmed from the medieval belief that water could weaken the body and allow evil spirits to come in. Louis XIV truly believed that his natural scent was a symbol of strength and divine right. This fateful choice to steer clear of water, as if it were a deadly disease, would lead to the terrible decay that was soon to overtake him. In January 1686, something would start to develop in the darkest, dampest part of the king's body. What began as a matter of royal pride would turn the Sun King into a living symbol of human decline. The Golden Prince, who used to dance until dawn, was on the verge of becoming something so horrifying that even his courtiers would avoid him. On January 15, 1686, Louis XIV, now 47, called for his personal physician, mentioning a minor discomfort he felt when sitting down. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, a man who had caused more deaths than the Black Death, quickly identified the issue as just common hemorrhoids. However, this was far from a straightforward medical problem. It marked the start of a 30-year nightmare that would gradually eat away at the Sun King from the inside. Within just a week, that minor discomfort escalated into intense pain that felt like a searing dagger piercing him every time he moved. By January 22nd, the swelling had increased to about the size of a walnut. By January 28th, Louis was experiencing continuous bleeding, which made it necessary for him to sit on soft cushions during state meetings. Then, on February 5th, the servants first noticed an unusual smell coming from the royal garments. By February 12th, pus and fecal matter were consistently leaking through an opening that had developed near his rectum. Picture the most revolting infection you've ever seen, and then amplify that nightmare 100 times. That was the situation for the most powerful man in Europe. The odor was something the palace had never encountered before. It was a foul stench that seemed to trail after Louis XIV, no matter where he went. Dr. Fagan kicked off his treatment with some medieval techniques that would make a torture chamber seem kind. It all started with the enemas. Not just 1 or 2, but several freezing cold water enemas each day. Over the next 6 months, court records indicate that Louis XIV went through more than 2,000 enemas, as Fagin tirelessly attempted to rid the royal intestines of harmful humors. When the enemas didn't work, Fagin moved on to using red-hot iron cautery. They would heat metal rods until they were glowing like embers, and then press them right into the infected area. While Louis XIV was restrained by several courtiers, his screams echoed down 3 floors in the palace, yet the infection continued to spread. Then came the forced bloodletting, where they drained 500 ml of blood from the king every single day to try to purify his corrupted essence. Unfortunately, the treatments weren't just failing, they were making everything a lot worse. Odd mixtures started to show up, prescribed by charlatans who managed to convince Fagin that they had miracle cures. Bull sperm blended with wine, bull's blood mixed with crushed pearls, frog fat melted in brandy. Each remedy was more repulsive and ineffective than the previous one. Still, Louis XIV endured them all in his frantic effort to uphold his divine reputation. By November 1686, the situation had become impossible to conceal. The smell was so bad that foreign diplomats were coming up with excuses to skip meetings with the king. It was clear that something drastic needed to happen, and that something would turn out to be one of the most gruesome medical procedures ever seen in royal history. Enter Charles-François Félix, the royal surgeon who faced the daunting task of either saving the Sun King or risking his life in the process. Félix realized he was up against an impossible task. He had to perform surgery on the most powerful monarch in Europe without any anesthesia, lacking proper surgical skills, and fully aware that if he failed, it would cost him his life. To get ready, he chose the most unsettling method imaginable. He practiced on 75 prisoners and volunteers. For months before the surgery, Félix would carry out 3 to 4 operations each week on prisoners who were sentenced to death, honing his skills on living people who had no option but to suffer through the pain. He crafted a unique, curved silver scalpel known as the Listorial, specifically designed for intricate work on the most intimate areas of the Sun King's body. November 18, 1686, marked a pivotal moment in history. At 6 a.m., the surgical team quietly gathered in the private chambers of Louis XIV, using hidden entrances to stay out of sight. There was no anesthesia available, and pain relief was not an option. Only 4 trusted courtiers were there to hold the king's arms and legs, while he had to bite down on a piece of wood to endure the most painful moments. What happened next was 3 hours of excruciating torture that would have defeated weaker individuals. Félix started to cut with his royal scalpel, meticulously slicing through the infected fistula, while Louis XIV stayed fully conscious, aware of every single incision. When the blade finally penetrated the deepest part of the abscess, a foul odor erupted that was so overwhelming that 2 surgical assistants rushed out of the room, gagging. Blood splattered over the silk bed sheets, resembling a red fountain. The king gritted his teeth on the wooden block as Félix sliced deeper, taking away the rotten tissue that had darkened with decay. At 9:15 a.m., when the scalpel finally hit the tailbone, Louis XIV let out a scream, shouting "Mondura!" for the first time, a cry of pain that resonated through 3 levels of the palace. Félix's hidden surgical notes, kept secret for 300 years and found only in 2007, detailed a process of extracting more than 200 ml of a greenish-blue pus that had a stench reminiscent of decaying bodies. As the infected tissue was removed in pieces, it exposed bone that had been eroded by the ongoing flow of decay. However, this was just the start of the horror. After 3 long hours, when Félix finally announced that the surgery was over, he found something shocking. The wound wasn't healing as it should, The infection had gone too deep. The damage to the tissue was far too severe. Louis XIV would need not just one surgery, but 4 different operations. On December 6th, the second surgery took place. Then, on December 8th, they had the third one. Finally, December 10th saw the most intense procedure of all. For 6 hours, while the Sun King was awake, his body was restrained by 6 men, and Felix carried out what could only be called butchery with surgical tools. In total, the surgeries lasted 15 hours over the course of 3 weeks. The infected tissue that was removed could have filled a large wine bowl. The pain experienced was beyond anything anyone could imagine. Yet, the wound kept draining, kept smelling, and kept rotting the Sun King from the inside. When the surgeries finally wrapped up and the wound started to heal, the court physicians called it a miracle. However, they had managed to create something much worse than just a medical issue. They turned Louis XIV into a person whose body would eternally decompose, whose odor would gain a legendary reputation, and whose physical deterioration would necessitate increasingly frantic efforts to hide it from the observing gaze of Europe. By March 1687, the surgical wounds had finally closed up. However, they resulted in something much worse than anyone had anticipated. A permanent anal fistula meant that feces and pus would leak out constantly for the remainder of Louis XIV's life. The Sun King, who was once renowned for his captivating natural masculine scent, now reeked of decay. The change happened quickly and had a huge impact. Foreign diplomats, who used to eagerly seek meetings with the magnificent king, were now scrambling to come up with excuses to stay away from him. The Venetian ambassador noted in his secret messages that trying to get close to the French king felt like stepping into a charnel house. It wasn't just that the smell was bad. It was just too much to handle, really nauseating, and totally impossible to overlook. Louis XIV decided to kick off what can only be called the most extravagant perfume revolution in history. He spent what would be around $2 million a year on scents brought in from all over the globe. Think Bulgarian roses, Arabian amber, and Indian sandalwood. He was willing to spend anything to hide the stench of his decaying body. The palace turned into a huge perfume factory. Fresh flowers were swapped out every couple of hours all over Versailles. Special containers known as caslettes released fragrant smoke non-stop in every room the king could enter. Servants were tasked with spraying perfume on the furniture before Louis XIV took a seat. They even tried to enhance the food with fragrant oils to cover up the smell of his breath. However, no amount of perfume could disguise what was happening to his body. The stress from numerous surgeries, along with his struggle to stay active, led to a shocking weight gain that alarmed even his most devoted fans. Starting at 165 pounds in 1670, Louis XIV skyrocketed to 265 pounds by 1700, and then astonishingly reached 310 pounds by 1710. The king, who used to move with agility, now needed 6 strong men to help him onto his horse. His throne had to be reconstructed 3 times because he kept getting bigger. Court painters were told to capture him from specific angles to disguise his size, but foreign guests weren't deceived. A Russian ambassador harshly remarked that the French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a heavy cow. Then there was the dental disaster of 1693 that turned him into something almost unrecognizable as human. Dr. D, believing that all diseases came from decay in the mouth, made the shocking decision to pull out every single tooth from the king's mouth in one brutal session. There was no anesthesia, no proper surgical tools, just harsh metal instruments and the cries of a 55-year-old man being painfully treated. The outcomes were shockingly horrific. Da managed to rip off part of Louis XIV's upper palate and broke his lower jaw while doing it. This resulted in a lasting gap between his mouth and nasal cavity. making food and wine shoot out of his nostrils whenever he attempted to eat. His speech turned slurred and hard to follow, compelling courtiers to get close to his foul breath just to catch his royal orders. Saliva constantly dripped from his toothless mouth. Along with the anal fistula and his immense weight, Louis XIV had turned from Europe's most sought-after king into a drooling, obese, foul-smelling mockery of royalty. However, what was truly astonishing about this decline was the lengths to which the court went to uphold the illusion of his divine perfection. Versailles came up with more than 200 new protocols aimed at concealing the king's disturbing condition. They created a color-coded system using silk ribbons to inform courtiers about Louis XIV's daily health status. Red ribbons indicated that they should keep their distance because he was in pain. White ribbons signaled that it was okay to approach, but they had to wear aromatic masks. Black ribbons indicated that the king was experiencing a particularly rough day with his bowel issues. The well-known mourning ceremony, previously a 2-hour display of royal splendor, was cut down to just 30 minutes to reduce the audience's exposure to the king's odor. The evening coucher was adjusted so that Louis XIV could discreetly be fitted with cloth padding to manage the ongoing leakage from his fistula. Thick curtains were thoughtfully arranged to conceal the changing of his soiled undergarments. The adjustments made to the environment were just as intricate. Windows were opened in specific patterns to generate air currents that would carry the king's odor away from guests. Additionally, 500 bowls of fresh flowers were replaced every hour throughout the palace. 50 specialized perfume machines ran continuously, generating fragrant clouds to cover up the unpleasant smell of decay. Courtiers had to carry decorative balls filled with aromatic substances whenever they came near the king. Some visitors even resorted to breathing through cloths soaked in perfume. The most refined women at court would often excuse themselves and throw up after having to meet with Louis XIV. Instead of admitting the truth about their unpleasant king, they would blame it on sudden, lady-related issues. As a result, foreign diplomatic relations started to decline because ambassadors found it harder to tolerate long meetings with the French monarch. The English ambassador asked if he could hold meetings outside for his health. Meanwhile, the Spanish representative started sending less senior diplomats instead of coming himself, which led some countries to wonder if the Sun King was really capable of ruling if he couldn't even handle basic bodily functions. Despite all this physical decline and intricate deception, Louis XIV still kept a tight hold on absolute power. The more his body let him down, the more he clung to the idea of divine monarchy. Every protocol, every ceremony, and every part of court life turned into an elaborate act meant to conceal the truth that their god-king was visibly deteriorating. But you really haven't seen anything yet compared to what unfolds in his last month. The terrifying experiences that Louis XIV faced in 1715 would make anything you've heard so far seem like a small nuisance. What he encountered in his final days would astonish even the doctors who believed they had witnessed the worst of human deterioration. It was August 11th, 1715, at 4:30 in the morning, when Louis XIV woke up screaming in pain, breaking the quiet of the pre-dawn hours in Versailles. His left leg felt like it was on fire from the inside. Dr. Fagan, who was now 72 and almost blind, was called in right away. His diagnosis of sciatica from too much sitting, which many considered a sign of his incompetence as a physician, was about to lead him to make a devastating mistake. What Dr. Fagan brushed off as just nerve pain was actually the onset of senile gangrene, a condition that would gradually consume the Sun King within the next 3 weeks. By August 15th, Louis XIV noticed the first dark spots on his big toe. By August 18th, those spots were spreading, and his skin felt like it was on fire. Then, on August 22nd, a new smell filled the air. It wasn't the usual foul odor of pus and waste. It was something much more horrific, the unmistakable stench of decaying human flesh. By August 25th, even Fagin couldn't ignore the reality of the situation any longer. The black discoloration had spread halfway up the king's foot, and the smell was so strong that servants were fainting as soon as they stepped into the royal bedroom. Modern medical experts determined that Louis XIV was dealing with dry, senile gangrene. This was due to poor circulation, along with an infection that could have been addressed with amputation. But who would even think about suggesting the amputation of a leg from a man who said he was chosen by God? The dread grew stronger with each day that went by. On August 28th, as the servants were changing the king's stockings, his big toe just fell off. The couriers fainted when they saw the white bones sticking out from the rotting flesh. On August 30th, the gangrene had spread to his shin, and the awful smell now filled 3 whole floors of the palace. Yet, astonishingly, Louis XIV continued to rule. This is what makes the final decline of the Sun King so remarkable. He kept on governing even while his body was literally falling apart. He signed royal decrees with a shaky hand as his body was falling apart. He welcomed foreign ambassadors, even though the scent of death lingered around him. He made military decisions in a voice that was becoming hoarse as the gangrene spread closer to his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in shock, "We're witnessing the French king's slow decline right before us." The Austrian representative called it the most horrifying sight he had ever seen. Nevertheless, the audiences kept coming. The workings of absolute monarchy continued, even as the king himself was turning into a living corpse. Courtiers began wearing scented masks when they entered the king's presence. The bed linens needed to be changed every 2 hours because fluids were leaking from the rotting tissue. 20 servants worked in shifts to take care of Louis XIV, but many of them asked to be transferred because they just couldn't handle the smell. It was so foul that even people in the palace gardens could notice it. Visitors could actually catch a whiff of the Sun King's decay from hundreds of yards away. Reactions from around the world varied from shock to intrigue. Doctors from foreign countries were sent to watch this extraordinary decline of the royal figure. Medical experts journeyed from all over Europe, not to provide assistance, but merely to see for themselves what they recognized would become the most recorded royal death ever. Letters and diplomatic messages rushed across the continent, outlining in graphic detail how the absolute monarchy was literally falling apart right in front of everyone's eyes. As August gave way to September, the gangrene spread to Louis XIV's calf and then up to his knee. Every day, as they tried to clean and bandage the affected areas, pieces of blackened flesh would just fall off. The king's leg resembled a scene from a battlefield, a grotesque mix of decaying tissue, exposed bone, and an infection that seemed immune to any medical treatment available at the time. On September 1st, 1715, it was the final day for Louis XIV. By 7 a.m., he struggled to speak because gangrene had spread to his throat muscles. He summoned his great-grandson to his bedside and, with a voice that sounded like sandpaper, whispered, "Don't follow my example. I've loved war too much." Those were some of his last clear words before the decay took away his ability to communicate properly. Sansimo, who was there in the last moments, documented the king's dying moments with a sharp eye. At 11 p.m. on August 31st, Louis XIV went through what we now recognize as the last stages of systemic gangrene. His body was failing as the toxic decay spread across his left side. His last words, barely discernible through his deteriorating throat, were, "Oh my God, come to my aid, Hurry to help me." At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, the heart of the Sun King finally stopped beating. However, the nightmare was far from over. The royal body started to decompose at an alarming rate. The infection that had plagued him for weeks didn't just vanish because his heart had stopped. In just a few hours, his already swollen corpse grew even larger as gases from bacteria accumulated inside. Dr. Marischal carried out the royal autopsy just 6 hours after death, racing against time before the body started to decompose too much for a proper examination. His report, which was kept secret for 200 years and only found in 1891, laid bare the shocking details of the medical disaster. The entire left side of the body, from foot to head, was affected by gangrene. The skin was peeling off everywhere, all the throat muscles were blackened with decay, and the intestines were twice their normal length, housing an unusually large tapeworm. The embalmer had an incredibly tough job ahead of him. Louis XIV's body was breaking down too quickly for standard preservation methods to keep up. They donned heavy cloth masks soaked in perfume to help with the smell. However, even with that, several of the assistants had to leave the room because they felt sick. The body was in such bad shape that they had to hurry through processes that usually took days to complete. The funeral turned into a grim spectacle. They had to seal the coffin right away and add extra lead because the body was still swelling from decomposition gases. While the body lay in state, odd popping and gurgling noises could be heard from inside the sealed casket as the Sun King's corpse literally began to fall apart. The final cover-up was just as complicated as anything else in his life. Official government statements claimed that the king passed away peacefully after a short illness. However, the truth was far more shocking. He endured 3 weeks of painful deterioration, with his body decaying while he was still aware of it. This reality was considered too gruesome for the public to handle. Within 48 hours of Louis XIV's death, a thorough effort to erase any evidence started. Dr. Fuegen's thorough medical records were destroyed in a fire. Dr. Felix's surgical diary was lost for 3 centuries. The autopsy report was hidden away in secret archives until 1891. Import records for the huge amounts of perfume used to cover up the royal decay were entirely wiped from official documents. The man who called himself the Sun King, who asserted he was divinely chosen and held absolute power, who constructed Versailles as a symbol of royal grandeur, had passed away as a decaying, foul-smelling mass of infected flesh. The ultimate irony was fully realized. The monarch who considered himself godlike met his end in a way that was more humiliating than that of the lowest peasant. His body was devouring itself, while his mind was trapped in that horror until the very last moment. So here it is. Louis the Fortune, once hailed as the most handsome ruler in Christendom, died in disgusting agony as his body literally ate itself from the inside out. The Sun King, who created Versailles as a symbol of divine monarchy, ended his reign in a gruesome state, as a decaying mass of infected flesh that even shocked his own doctors. Today's medical experts recognize what the physicians of the 17th century failed to see. All of this could have been avoided. Proper hygiene, regular bathing, and timely amputation of the infected area could have saved his life. The arrogance of absolute monarchy and the belief in divine right ultimately led Louis XIV to die like a sick animal instead of seeking the medical care that might have saved him. The irony is truly staggering. The man who insisted he was chosen by God, who expected total obedience from millions of people, and who constructed the most magnificent palace in Europe, spent his last years as a living corpse, with his own courtiers having to avoid being around him. The idea that kings have a divine right to rule didn't stand a chance against the common human experiences of aging and death. The legacy of the Sun King is remembered not only as a sign of royal splendor, but also as evidence that absolute power can't overcome the fundamental truths of human mortality. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next investigation.